Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Welcome to our weekly explained session. But before we begin, let me remind you to like and comment on the video, share the videos with your fellow aspirants, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So let's get started with the topic for today, that is Pegasus Spyware and state surveillance. See, this Pegasus Spyware is in news of late. It has triggered a major political controversy in India and around the world. So in today's session, we shall keep the controversies aside, keep the assumptions and allegations aside, and focus on a fact-based discussion purely from an examination perspective. We are going to talk about the Pegasus spyware. We will talk about the technology behind it. We'll understand to what extent does this spyware pose a cybersecurity risk. We shall also talk about state surveillance, why state surveillance is required, what are the legal frameworks around it, and how does state surveillance violate our constitutional rights and liberties. So let's begin by understanding why this topic is in news. See, just a few days back, a major explosive news was published around the world. It was part of a global collaborative investigative project known as Project Pegasus. This was a global collaborative initiative that involved several popular and reputed media outlets such as Washington Post from the US, Le Monde from France, The Guardian from UK, Wire from India, and the others. It also involved a few not-for-profit organizations like Forbidden Stories, which is a Paris-based organization. It also involved human rights organizations like Amnesty International. This collaborative, they conducted investigative research with regard to the usage of a spyware, a highly sophisticated malware which was being used for surveillance around the world. And they brought out a report which claimed or which alleged that thousands of people around the world, especially noted personalities, they were being targeted for surveillance by using this malware or spyware. In India, it has been alleged that hundreds of noted personalities and individuals have been targeted, including top opposition leaders, several constitutional authorities, especially a former election commissioner, then several prominent journalists, especially those who are critical of the government, and as well as social activists who are known to organize protests against the government, and even businessmen or entrepreneurs were not spared from this targeted surveillance. And interestingly, even a few government ministers were reportedly brought under this surveillance network by using the Pegasus spyware. That is the reason why the topic is in news. So first, let's understand what is Pegasus. See, Pegasus is a highly sophisticated military-grade spyware. A spyware is essentially a malware. It's a malicious software which is used to infect a target device. And this particular malware, that is the spyware that we are talking about, it was used for spying or espionage. It was used for collecting intelligence covertly or through a secret manner. This sophisticated spyware was developed by an Israeli cyber arms firm known as the NSO Group. This spyware has been extensively used in countries around the world. Allegedly, governments have used this particular malware to target political dissidents and activists. They reportedly have used it to stifle free speech and right to privacy. It is on these grounds that the topic became very controversial, and the NSO Group, which has designed and developed this spyware, which has been selling this malware, has stated that it sells the spyware only to vetted foreign governments. It doesn't sell the spyware to non-state actors or to private individuals. It has been selling it only to government entities which have been vetted and approved by the Israeli government. That is why the suspicion, the allegations have been cast on governments around the world for engaging in targeted surveillance by using the Pegasus malware. So let's understand how this malware was working. Let's talk about the methodology which was employed in the designing and in the development of Pegasus. See, Pegasus is known to target all types of phones. It is primarily meant to target smartphones, and irrespective of the make and the operating system that it's running on, Pegasus is capable of infiltrating and infecting smartphone devices. It is known to affect the Apple iPhones that run on iOS and as well as the Android phones. And research shows that Pegasus has been designed to attack a target device by using multiple vectors or through multiple routes, as it has been given over here. See, Pegasus is in news not just in the last few days, but it has been in the news since quite a few years. In fact, the existence of such a sophisticated malware was known since 2018 at least, because the attacks using Pegasus Spyware was going on from the last 3 to 4 years, and it was reported back in 2018 and as well as in 2019 that Pegasus was being used by government agencies to carry out targeted surveillance. In India as well, in 2019, a similar controversy had broken out. Then it had been alleged that Indian government was using Pegasus to target a group of activists who have been charged under the strict anti-terrorism laws such as the UAPA. So it was alleged back in 2019 as well that the Pegasus malware was being misused to target free speech and to violate privacy. But now the issue is back in news because an explosive publication has come out stating that thousands of people around the world have been targeted and governments are using this to carry out targeted surveillance in violation of fundamental rights and constitutional liberties. So in the initial version of this spyware, which was being used back in 2018 and 2019, this malware was employing a technique known as spear phishing. This is one of the techniques of carrying out a cyber attack. In spear phishing, a fraudulent mail or a message is sent out in order to trick or deceive the target, and it is designed to carry out social engineering. It's basically a behavioral change that is introduced into the target, into the user, where he or she is tricked into taking up an action or committing an action based on the reception of this fraudulent mail or this fraudulent message. For example, you might receive a mail or a message or even a call asking you to carry out some action. You might be, triggered to open the message and click on a malicious link, or you might receive a call, and this will automatically lead to the downloading of the malware onto your phone. Once downloaded, it will get installed, and all of this will happen covertly in a stealthy manner without you being aware of it. In the front, you won't be able to notice the changes, but once you open these fraudulent messages, or once you click on the malicious link, or once you receive these calls, right? Once you become a victim of social engineering and spear phishing, you will end up downloading the malware, which will get installed, and immediately the attacker will gain control over the target phone. Now it has been reported that this malware has been upgraded. It has been made even more sophisticated, and in the latest version, the developers, the ones who designed and coded this malware, that is the NSO group, they have introduced a feature which makes it a zero-click attack malware, meaning it doesn't require any intervention from the user. The target need not be tricked or deceived into clicking on something or with regard to opening a message or receiving a call. Without any such user intervention, the malware can be installed and it will lead to the infection of the targeted mobile phone. Once this happens, the attacker will get remote access to the device and he will gain complete command and control over the targeted device. Like I mentioned earlier, the device will not reflect any changes once it has been infected. The malware has been designed to have stealth features. It operates on the back end, and it is even capable of covering any digital footprint. It can even cover its tracks, wipe out any evidence of its presence, and even if digital forensics are carried out later, chances are very less that you will be able to uncover the digital footprint of this malware. So such a highly sophisticated malware has been designed, and it has been used mainly for targeted surveillance. According to allegations that are being made by media outlets, it is government entities which are using the malware to carry out targeted interception. Now, what will happen after such an interception is carried out? Once the phone is infected, the attacker gains complete remote access to the device. He will be able to command the phone, control the phone, manage its operations, and control its functionality. So this gives tremendous capabilities to the attacker. The attacker will be able to read the messages, read the mails, or go through the chats, the call logs, the contact list, listen to who the target is speaking to, observe where he is going. Any such features are possible. He can access the media files. The camera can be activated without the knowledge of the user. It can be used to record ongoing calls, even access GPS data, that is location data, to track the movement of the target. So like this malware is capable of harvesting very sensitive and very intimate data about the target. So as I mentioned, the malware will give remote access to the attacker. He can start sending instructions to the phone. He can start controlling the phone the way it behaves and execute a set of instructions which will help in harvesting the personal data, the private data of the target. So by doing this, the attacker can access the keystrokes, the target, how he is typing the keyboard, the passwords, credit card information if required, calendar details, messages, voice calls, etc. And without the knowledge of the target, the camera can be turned on, the microphone can be turned on. It basically means that the attackers can listen and watch as to what the target is doing. And all of this will happen without the knowledge of the user. The location data can be tracked, and if required, even documents can be planted on the target phone. They would be able to place false evidence in order to implicate the target in a particular case. Even this is possible, and such incidents have been noted and uncovered during the investigation that went on under Project Pegasus. This malware also comes with a number of other stealth features. The designers, the ones who developed the code, they've ensured that the malware doesn't leave behind any trail or any evidence to alert the target. See, for example, when the device is sending large volumes of data back to the command control server, obviously the data consumption of the device will increase. So if there is a sudden jump in data consumption, the target might notice the change. He might become aware that something's wrong with the phone. So to avoid that, the phone has been engineered through the malware to send out the data at scheduled intervals. It will send out the data only when it is connected to a Wi-Fi network. It will not use mobile data to transmit the information, because generally if there is a sudden jump in the mobile data consumption, the user will become aware of it. Whereas when we are connected to Wi-Fi networks, we are not so cautious about the data that we are consuming. So the malware has been programmed in such a way that it will connect with the command control server at only scheduled intervals, especially when it's connected to a Wi-Fi network. This has been done to ensure that the target doesn't get any indication that the phone has been hijacked. He will not get any indication that the phone has been infected with a very sophisticated malware. So once this happens, the attacker gains full control over the phone, thus leading to the compromise of the privacy of the user. Every information on the phone, every personal sensitive information related to the target can be accessed by the attacker. Okay? So this malware is designed to evade any forensic analysis, to avoid any possible detection. It is even able to sidestep any antivirus softwares that have been installed, and more importantly, the attackers can delete the malware when required. After the task of surveillance is done, after carrying out surveillance for a few weeks or for a few months, they can delete the application and even eliminate any traces or any digital footprint that the malware might leave behind. So then the question is, how did the investigators figure out that Pegasus malware was being used for surveillance? If it is not leaving behind any evidence or any trail, how did they figure out that the malware was being used? See, what happened was, the not-for-profit organization known as Forbidden Stories, it gained access to a leaked document. This document consisted a list of around 50,000 phone numbers from around the world, from countries around the world. And Forbidden Stories got information from a leaked document of the NSO group that Pegasus malware was being used for targeted government surveillance. So this not-for-profit organization then tied up with Amnesty International and several reputed media outlets, and by using the cyber wing of Amnesty International, they conducted thorough digital forensic analysis. They approached the potential targets who were there on this list, requested some of them to hand over their mobile phones so that they could carry out the investigation. Some of them agreed, gave them their phones, and during this digital forensic analysis, they came across some evidence, some small trails of evidence that are still left behind by the malware. Because evidently the malware has not wiped out its presence entirely, and it has left behind a small digital footprint. These traces of evidence has been picked out by the researchers, by the investigators, thereby confirming and indicating that the numbers which were there on the target list, at least some of them, have been definitely targeted by using the Pegasus malware. So that's the reason why this malware has raised so much concern. Its sophistication, its highly intrusive nature makes it a potential tool for constant cyber surveillance. It's basically turning your phone, your smartphones, into a constant surveillance tool. Now the question is, should we all be worried about this malware? Should a common person, should we be worried about this malware, and should we treat this as a cybersecurity risk? See, ideally speaking, Pegasus is so sophisticated that it can target any phone. It can infect any device it wants. But however, this is not how the malware has been designed. It has not been designed for mass surveillance. Please remember that. It has been specifically designed for targeted surveillance. It has been designed to pick out a few select phones and target them. And if you go through the documents that are being leaked and the list of potential candidates who were listed out for surveillance, if you go through the list, you will notice that it's only noted personalities who are being targeted. It's either politicians, head of states and head of governments, diplomats, journalists, social activists, human rights activists, and of course businessmen. So it's such noted personalities who are being targeted because Pegasus is a tool for targeted surveillance. It's not a tool for mass surveillance. That doesn't mean our phones are not at risk. If required, whoever is using Pegasus can use it to target any device. But as of now, it is used only for targeted surveillance by governments, right? So now, what kind of measures can one take to protect against this cybersecurity risk? See, in the initial version of the malware, clickbait attacks were being carried out. As I explained, spear phishing technique was being used, a fraudulent mail or message was being sent, and social engineering was being carried out. Basically, the target was being deceived, he was being tricked to commit some action. It was only after committing that action the malware was getting downloaded. In such cases, if that version of the Pegasus is used, then a few basic cyber safety measures can be taken. For example, if users are more aware of spear phishing attacks, if you have better awareness about such social engineering techniques, you will be able to distinguish between genuine messages and fraudulent messages. So if you're able to do that, obviously you will avoid opening those messages, you will not click on those malicious links, and you will protect yourself from the attack. Or you can even implement a few basic cybersecurity protocols. You can have a basic firewall. You can upgrade your cybersecurity features on the phone. So by taking such measures, you can protect yourself from such spear phishing attacks. But however, the current version of Pegasus, which is being used, doesn't work like this. It has been made even more sophisticated. Right now, Pegasus is capable of zero-click attack. Without any user intervention, without any action being taken by the user, it can infect the device. So this makes it very difficult to prevent the attack. It's almost impossible because the target would never even know that his phone has come under surveillance. It's possible to install the Pegasus malware through push notifications. It's capable of exploiting any vulnerabilities in the software. It's capable of exploiting any security weakness in the operating system. It can exploit any vulnerability in popular applications like WhatsApp. In fact, WhatsApp has actually filed a litigation against NSO Group because WhatsApp was one of the most preferred platforms for targeting mobile phones through Pegasus. Pegasus exploited one of the vulnerabilities on WhatsApp. The targets would receive a WhatsApp call, and even if they don't receive the call, just the ring was sufficient to push the malware and get it installed on the target device. So since Pegasus had compromised the user privacy of the customers of WhatsApp, WhatsApp has taken NSO Group to court and currently it's fighting a litigation. So this is the sophistication of the malware, and in that case, it's almost impossible or very difficult to prevent these kind of attacks, right? So if this is the case, the question is, who's the one using this malware? If the malware is so sophisticated, if it is violating privacy, violating your basic rights, if it is carrying out highly intrusive surveillance, if it is collecting intimate personal information, then who are the ones who are using this malware? That is the question. As NSO Group has stated, it has publicly acknowledged that it sells the malware only to vetted foreign governments, only to those foreign governments which have been approved by the Israeli government, only to those governments the malware is sold. So these foreign governments obviously deploy the malware through their intelligence and security agencies. The primary purpose of this malware is to fight terrorism and deal with crime, especially organized crime. So the objective of the malware is actually to fight against any national security threats. So this is definitely a legitimate objective that makes Pegasus a legitimate tool for surveillance and intelligence gathering. But problem arises when the same tool is misused by governments, when there are no checks and balances in the system, and when it is used to target political dissidents and critics of the government, because that would be a case of violating fundamental rights and constitutional liberties. As Project Pegasus has revealed, if you look at the list of potential candidates who were targeted for surveillance, it becomes very clear that many governments around the world, possibly including the Indian government, had used Pegasus most likely to target politicians, to target government officials, social activists and journalists. This is where the problem arises. See, as NSO Group has stated, governments have a legitimate objective in containing national security threats like terrorism or espionage by a foreign country or covert wars or proxy wars by hostile intelligence agencies. For that purpose, surveillance tools like Pegasus can definitely be used, but with checks and balances. There should be legal safeguards that governs its usage. If they don't exist, if the malware is grossly misused, if it is widely applied to target anybody who is against the government, then the problem arises because that would be a case of targeted surveillance which is in violation of the law and violation of the constitution. So now let's talk about state surveillance in more detail. Let's understand the legal framework that exists which enables state surveillance in India. Let's understand why is it needed and how can we ensure that state surveillance is not misused to target political dissent. See, state-sponsored surveillance, that is espionage and surveillance, it is as old as the human civilization itself. From ancient times to medieval times till the modern days, surveillance has always been used as an integral part of statecraft. It's very much a part of the job the government does. The governments are meant to protect the sovereignty and the integrity of the nation. They are meant to protect the country against any security threats. As I mentioned, the threat of terrorism, the threat posed by any hostile countries or hostile governments, threats posed by criminals, etc. To deal with these threats, states have a legitimate right to engage in surveillance. It's a very essential part of espionage and intelligence collection. But the problem arises when this surveillance is not limited, when there are no checks and balances. Like I said, from time immemorial, surveillance is being used. Even in the ancient medieval times, espionage networks, they would intercept the messengers. They would try to intercept the communication that was going on. Even postal letters, back in those days, back a few decades ago, even postal letters were being intercepted. Then of course telephones, telegraphs, and now smartphones, the internet, computer devices, etc. They have become the target for interception by intelligence agencies. This state-led surveillance is legitimate and valid only when it is going behind a potential target who could pose a national security threat. If the surveillance is being used to track terrorists, if it is being used to hunt down criminals, if it is being used to uphold the security interests of the state and in the larger interests of public safety, then such surveillance is valid, it is legitimized. It is recognized in the Constitution and through our legal framework as well. But however, if this surveillance becomes unlimited, if there are no checks and balances, then we run the risk of promoting widespread surveillance on the citizens, which could result in mass surveillance as well. Governments might misuse these powers, especially the ruling parties, they might misuse the powers to violate the fundamental rights and liberties that are guaranteed through the Constitution. This will result in the rise of tyranny, and this technique is used not just by autocratic governments to stifle dissent, but unfortunately even by several democratic governments. For example, the United States, United Kingdom, and other European countries, even they are known to engage in both mass surveillance and targeted surveillance. There have been many controversies that have broken out in the Western countries as well, which happen to be democratic nations. Even in India, the problem is not just with the current government. From many decades, we have dealt with these controversies where governments have been accused of engaging in widespread surveillance. So that's the reason why this topic becomes so controversial. It acquires political overtones. So that being the case, we should understand the legal mechanisms that exist in India which enable surveillance within the boundaries of the Constitution. See, in India, lawful surveillance is allowed through two primary legislations. There are two important laws which provide for legal interception of telephones and mobile networks. This includes the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885 and as well as the Information Technology Act of 2000. The Indian Telegraph Act, it's of colonial origin. This law enables the interception of phone calls made through landline phones, mobile phones, etc. Then we have the IT Act, the Information Technology Act of 2000. This provides for interception of all forms of electronic communication. That is the communication that takes place between two computer devices which are transacting over the internet. It could be a laptop, a desktop computer, a mobile phone, right, a smartphone. All these smart devices, the computer devices or electronic devices, they could be brought under surveillance as per the provisions of Information Technology Act. Now let's look at these provisions in more detail. Let's understand what kind of legal mechanisms exist that provides for lawful interception of phones and communication networks in India. See, under the Indian Telegraph Act, we have section 5. This provision empowers both central government and the state governments to intercept calls in certain situations. What are these situations? Either when there is a public emergency or in the interest of public safety. On these two grounds, only on these two grounds, phone calls can be intercepted by the central government and the state government. Basically, there are a set of grounds which have been defined under these interests. These are nothing but the restrictions, the reasonable restrictions that are already present under Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. See, Article 19 of the Constitution guarantees right to free speech and expression. But this is not an absolute fundamental right. It comes with a set of reasonable restrictions. These restrictions include sovereignty and integrity of the nation. If the sovereignty and the integrity of the nation is under threat, then your right to free speech can be curbed. Similarly, your right to privacy, which falls under Article 21, it could be curbed on the grounds of the sovereignty and integrity of the nation. Meaning, governments can carry out interception, they can intercept your personal communication, your personal interaction, if your communication is threatening the sovereignty and the integrity of the nation. So it means that if there are terrorists, if there are criminals, or if there are foreign agents or foreign spies who are threatening the security of the nation, then lawful interception can be carried out against them. Similarly, there are other grounds: the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign countries, public order, that is, if a group of people, if they are organizing any violent protests which could threaten law and order, such individuals could be targeted with state surveillance in order to preserve public order. Then, of course, if there is any immediate incitement to the commission of an actual offense, a violent offense. On these grounds, the Indian Telegraph Act permits the state to carry out interception of phone calls and mobile networks. Is that clear? But however, there are a few safeguards which have been inserted under this law. There are a few provisions which provides for some protection for journalists in order to uphold the fundamental right to free speech. There are a few basic safeguards that have been included for protecting free speech. But unfortunately, these safeguards are not sufficient, because every now and then governments have tended to misuse these interception powers to violate free speech and the freedom of expression. There's one more very important safeguard that has been included under the provisions of the Telegraph Act. This is related to the PUCL case of 1996. PUCL is a not-for-profit organization, the People's Union for Civil Liberties. It had approached the Supreme Court back in 1996, challenging some of the provisions of the Indian Telegraph Act. In this landmark case, the Supreme Court recognized the right to individuals' privacy. It didn't recognize right to privacy as a fundamental right, but however, it did recognize the importance of an individual's privacy. In this case, the Supreme Court clearly stated that government surveillance can threaten the privacy of an individual. It is this ruling of the Supreme Court which became a basis later to declare right to privacy as a fundamental right in the landmark K.S. Puttaswamy case, which we are going to discuss a few minutes later. However, in this particular case in 1996, the Supreme Court highlighted the threat to privacy through government surveillance. Hence, it called for additional safeguards. It called for legal measures, legal mechanisms within the law which could help in protecting the individual's privacy from any gross misuse of surveillance powers. Based on these guidelines, Rule number 419A was drafted and added to the Telegraph rules in 2007. As per these rules, a well-established procedure has been laid out under the Indian Telegraph Act based on which interception can be carried out by the government. As per the procedure, any order to intercept a phone, the order has to come from the Home Secretary. For the Union government, it would be the Union Home Secretary. At the state level, it would be the secretary to the Home Department, the state level Home Secretary. From the Home Secretaries, the orders for interception has to come as per Rule 419A. This ensures that there is high level scrutiny, high level involvement of government officials in approving state surveillance. This ensures some set of accountability at the highest levels of the government. Then there is also a procedure for establishing a review committee to review these orders which have been passed by the Home Secretary. This review committee would be headed by the Cabinet Secretary at the central level. The Cabinet Secretary is the highest ranking civil servant. So he would head a review committee which would periodically review the surveillance orders that have been issued by the Union Home Secretary. On similar lines, a state level review committee would also exist, which would be headed by the Chief Secretary of the state. This committee would review the interception orders that have been passed by the State Home Secretary. So such legal safeguards have been included under the Indian Telegraph Act. But however, legal and constitutional experts, they point out that these safeguards are not sufficient. Why? Because this is a mechanism of internal accountability within the government. This does not guarantee any external accountability. There is no independent accountability of the government agencies, the intelligence agencies, which are involved in carrying out interception. Because this is a case where government officials are ordering surveillance, they themselves would be reviewing those orders within the government. So this process is very opaque, it's not transparent. These details are not revealed to the public. They are well guarded secrets of the state, they are classified, they are part of the classified information, and the common public will not have access to these orders or to the review that goes on within the government. This is just a legal safeguard which ensures internal accountability within the government. What's the guarantee that the government will not misuse these provisions? Who will ensure external accountability? For that you need a independent evaluation from the outside. You need an autonomous review from the outside of the government. That doesn't exist under the Indian Telegraph Act. Now, look at the IT Act, the Information Technology Act. Under this, you have Section 69. It is this section which creates a legal framework for electronic surveillance in the country. The IT Act goes one step beyond the Indian Telegraph Act. It's said to be more broad and wide in its provisions because it sidesteps all the restrictions that are there under the Telegraph Act and the restrictions that have been laid out under Article 19. I told you earlier that to carry out interception, there has to be two justifiable grounds. One, there should be a public emergency, or two, it should be on the ground of protecting public safety. And these are the reasonable restrictions, the points listed out over here. They are covered under Article 19 of the Constitution, and the Indian Telegraph Act also makes an explicit mention of these grounds. But however, Section 69 of the IT Act doesn't make any such references. There are no such restrictions. Instead, the IT Act says that interception, monitoring and decryption of digital information can be done for the sake of investigating any offense. For investigating any offense, the government will acquire the powers to carry out digital interception. This is a very broad provision. It's a very wide provision. It has dispensed or set aside the grounds of public emergency and public safety. Even without these grounds, even in case of investigating any criminal offense, the government agencies can invoke this provision to carry out digital surveillance. That is why Section 69 of the IT Act always comes in for heavy criticism. Okay? Those safeguards are missing, and that's exactly the reason why such state surveillance with minimal legal safeguards can result in the violation of your fundamental rights and liberties. State surveillance runs into conflict with Article 19 and Article 21. Article 19 guarantees right to free speech, right to expression, and the right to free press. Right to free speech and free press is at the very foundation of a constitutional democracy. But state surveillance, if it is not checked, if it is not restricted and contained, if there are no legal safeguards, if there is no accountability, it could threaten the very foundations of a constitutional democracy. Then even right to privacy under Article 21, because recently in 2017, in the landmark KS Puttaswamy case, the Supreme Court recognized that right to privacy is integral to right to life, which is guaranteed under Article 21. So that being the case, unchecked state surveillance can violate all these rights and liberties. It's very much possible. If the government of the day decides to misuse the intelligence apparatus, or if it decides to misuse the surveillance platforms that are there, then it could be using these capabilities to target opposition parties, journalists and activists. Basically, anybody who criticizes the government, who takes a stand against the government, could become a target of such surveillance. That is the fear. So this legitimate fear has led to a major political controversy right now because of the revelations surrounding the Pegasus malware. The potential list of targets that has been leaked, that has been released, shows that many opposition leaders, journalists and activists were on the target list. If it is authentic, if the allegations are true, then it possibly indicates that the government had placed a wide net on all these individuals who were against the government. But in a democracy, being against the government is not a crime. Opposing the government, criticizing the government, or organizing protests against the government, that is peaceful protests, it's not a crime. For this, if you're brought under surveillance, that would end up crippling your free speech and expression. It could also breach your right to privacy. So this is the threat posed by state surveillance. So in order to ensure that state surveillance doesn't breach the individual's right to privacy, the Supreme Court put in place a four-fold test or a four-step test under the landmark KS Puttaswamy case of 2017. When the Supreme Court declared that right to privacy is a fundamental right under Article 21, the Supreme Court put in place this four-step test which has to be satisfied by the state if it is breaching an individual's right to privacy. What are these safeguards? Point number one, the state can carry out such surveillance and breach an individual's privacy only when it is sanctioned by law. There should be a legal mechanism which is approving that surveillance, and we already have that. We have the IT Act and the Telegraph Act. So the legal mechanisms exist for creating a lawful framework to enable surveillance. But however, the agencies which are carrying out the surveillance, are they established by law? That is the question. Because in India, we have many intelligence agencies and many security agencies. Very few of them have been set up through law. Very few of them have a legal backing. For example, NIA, the National Investigation Agency, it has been established through a parliamentary act. It is regulated as per this legislation. Its functioning, its operations are controlled by the NIA Act. Law enforcement agencies like NIA, they are accountable to the Indian Parliament. Whereas there are many other intelligence agencies like IB and RAW which are not accountable to the Parliament. They are not established through law. So this is the first test that the Supreme Court has prescribed under the KS Puttaswamy case. Next, the government will have to satisfy the test of necessity and proportionality. The government will have to show that carrying out such surveillance is necessary. It's absolutely necessary. Meaning it should have tried out every other route, every other alternative to collect that information. Only when no other alternative exists, only then it should employ state surveillance. Then the surveillance should be proportional to the threat. Based on the threat perception, the risk, proportional to that, the state surveillance should be set up. The state surveillance should be proportional to the threat and the risk that we are dealing with. It can't be disproportional. So any breach of right to privacy should satisfy the test of necessity and proportionality. Next, the third safeguard, the state should have a legitimate aim for action. It should have a legitimate objective, which is either to deal with a potential public emergency such as a terror attack, or it should be in the interest of public safety. For example, to prevent arms trafficking or to prevent the induction of fake Indian currency notes into India. These are public safety interests because it threatens the national security of the country. So such a specific legitimate objective should be met through state surveillance. Otherwise, this breach of privacy will not be justified. It won't be lawful, it would be unconstitutional. Then the last safeguard is that there should be procedural guarantees against any potential abuse of power. Meaning there should be transparent legal safeguards, legal mechanisms which will ensure accountability in the system. If few officials or if few government ministers or if government leaders, if they are misusing these powers, if they are abusing them, there should be a system through which they could be held accountable. So for that, you need a legal mechanism. You need procedural guarantees and legal safeguards which is accessible to the people. It should be transparent, and through this, the citizens, the ones who are getting affected, the ones whose rights are being compromised, they should be able to hold the government accountable. When these four grounds are met, then the state has a right to breach an individual's right to privacy. This is what the Supreme Court said in the K.S. Puttaswamy case. But unfortunately, if you look at the way in which Indian intelligence and security agencies function, there are many shortcomings. There are many cases where they don't satisfy the fourfold test. For example, we have intelligence agencies like IB, RAW, the National Technical Research Organization, the Defense Intelligence Agency, etc. All these intelligence agencies, they have no legal basis. They have not been set up through law. They have not been set up through an act of the parliament. Instead, they have been set up through executive orders of the government. So these intelligence agencies are solely accountable to the government. Is that clear? There is no independent accountability of these intelligence agencies. But we do have a few law enforcement agencies like NIA, as we discussed, then NCB, the Narcotics Control Bureau. Such law enforcement agencies, they have been set up through a law of the parliament. They have a legal basis. The NIA Act, the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. These acts have set up NIA and the NCB. So their functioning is regulated by these laws, and in some form or the other, they have independent accountability, meaning the parliament can exercise oversight over the functioning of these agencies. But however, intelligence agencies like IB and RAW would be completely outside of the ambit of the Indian parliament. So that's why we say that there is no independent accountability in the case of such intelligence agencies. Then we have other central agencies which also have been given the powers to carry out surveillance and interception. For example, CBI, the CBDT or the Central Board of Direct Taxes, the DRI or the Directorate of Revenue Intelligence. Even these agencies have surveillance powers, but unfortunately they lack autonomy. They are very much part of the government. They don't have any independent autonomy of their own. Their functioning is entirely governed by the decisions of the government and its ministers. That is, they are only accountable to the political class. So as a result, even these institutions have no independent accountability. In fact, several experts have always questioned, why are taxation and finance related institutions, why have they been given surveillance and interception powers? This has always been a bone of contention. In fact, a few years back, a cabinet secretary had even brought up the issue, stating that the Supreme Court is against giving CBDT interception powers and surveillance powers. But still, organizations like CBDT continue to have powers of surveillance. Then, as you all know, organizations like CBI, they function completely under the political leaders. The autonomy of these institutions doesn't exist, and they function directly under the orders of the government. So in that case as well, you can't ensure independent accountability. Then coming to state police, which also have powers for surveillance and interception, they usually function in a very opaque manner. The orders issued by the state home secretary, It's very opaque. It's not open for any review. The review that happens, it happens internally. There is only internal accountability. But the public can't place their faith in such internal accountability. There should be some form of independent accountability. As you know, our police forces are not autonomous. They have been heavily politicized. So there are many instances that we can quote in the past, recently as well, where intelligence apparatus has been misused by the ruling parties to target their political opponents. This is very common at the state level as well. The opposition parties, their leaders are often targeted through police surveillance. The ministers and the leaders, they keep a track of their opposition leaders. This happens at the central level as well. There are many instances in the past. It's not just the current governments. Even in the past, we have had many scandals break out on this particular issue. The reason why these issues keep coming up is because our intelligence and security agencies, they have been heavily politicized. Many of them, they are not accountable on the outside. They only report to the government, and their entire accountability is towards the political class. And since the political leaders control the appointments, transfers, it becomes easier for them to control the functioning of intelligence agencies and security agencies. Is that clear? That is why every now and then these surveillance powers, which are actually needed for protecting the country's national security, could get misused, thus resulting in the violation of fundamental rights. Okay? It could be misused by the ruling parties to target any political opponent, any dissident who is critical of the government. This will end up having a chilling effect on the right to free speech and free press. If journalists and if political opponents and social activists, if they are constantly targeted through state surveillance, it will instill a sense of fear in the minds of journalists. It would essentially send out a message that if any journalist reports against the government, or if any activist protests against the government, then they would be subjected to state surveillance, which would breach their privacy. Based on this unlawful surveillance, false charges could be filed against them. As we discussed, Pegasus is capable of downloading and installing evidence on the phones. Let's say, for example, there is a journalist who is criticizing the government, which is his constitutional right. But if the government decides to misuse its powers, it can use a malware like Pegasus and install any false evidence or place any false evidence on his phone. What if any terror material or literature is placed on his phone, which will implicate him in a terror related case? Such threats do exist, this risk exists, not just in India but around the world. That is why state surveillance is always, it should always be held accountable. It is very much needed, but there should be legal safeguards. There should be checks and balances. Otherwise, it will end up having a chilling effect on free speech and free expression. If journalists are targeted again and again, it will send out a message to every journalist in the country that if they write against the government, if they freely target the government, they could become targets of such surveillance. So this fear which gets instilled in this entire community will end up having a chilling effect. Right? The same will happen for political opponents. If opposition parties are targeted with investigation, with surveillance, because they are opposing the government, if social activists are often targeted, it will send out a message and it will instill a fear amongst them, and the whole community will be scared in the future to raise their voice. That's why it is said that such widespread surveillance will have a chilling effect. Even the judiciary has recognized this. The Supreme Court calls it the doctrine of chilling effect. If there is such a widespread threat to free speech and expression, then journalists and political opposition leaders and activists, they would be pushed into submission. The fear will drive them into submission. Everybody would be scared about speaking out. They would be scared that if they speak out, the government will target them with surveillance, collect some evidence or plant evidence on them and implicate them in false charges. So this fear will end up crippling the right to free speech and expression. It will also violate the right to a free press. That's the reason why we need independent regulation. There should be external oversight over intelligence agencies and security agencies. There should be some form of external accountability. Ideally, this should come from the parliament or maybe even from the judiciary. This is the model followed in many democracies as well, in many developed nations. For example, if you look at United States, their intelligence agencies like the CIA, they are accountable to the Senate and the House of Representatives. In fact, there is even a Senate Intelligence Committee which every now and then looks into the functioning of the intelligence agencies. They raise questions against them. They hold the officials accountable in certain areas of their operations. Even in the United Kingdom, its intelligence agencies like MI6, MI5, they are accountable to the British Parliament. They are answerable to parliamentary standing committees on intelligence. They have to submit their records, provide accounts of their operations to members of the parliamentary standing committees on intelligence. So such parliamentary oversight along with timely judicial intervention will actually help in safeguarding our fundamental rights while promoting state surveillance, which is needed to protect the country's national security. But when the agencies are heavily politicized and when there are no legal safeguards, or if the legal safeguards are inadequate, as we saw under the IT Act and the Telegraph Act, then a lot of opportunities are available through which surveillance could be misused by the ruling parties to target political opposition, to target anybody who is against the government. Okay? Now, in the end, let's talk about the response of the government of India to these allegations. Like I said, the problem is not just with the current government. Surveillance has been happening from many decades, and many such scandals have broken out in the past as well. Right now, the scandal is centered around the misuse of Pegasus, which has been brought out through Project Pegasus, which is a global investigative initiative. The same controversy has broken out in other countries as well. Many diplomats, many head of states and head of governments, even they have been targeted. So in India, this has triggered off a political controversy, and the government of India has responded by dismissing these allegations of unlawful surveillance. The government has said no such unlawful surveillance has taken place, but any surveillance that takes place is justified, authorized and lawful. It's very important to note that the government has not denied explicitly deploying Pegasus. The government of India till date, see, till now there have been two controversies, one in 2019 and the current controversy. In both the cases, the government never denied procuring Pegasus from Israel, from NSO group. So this indirectly indicates that the Indian government, just like many other governments around the world, have procured Pegasus to be used by their intelligence and security agencies. The idea is to serve a lawful purpose, that is to protect the country against national security threats. That's why the government has not denied deploying Pegasus. But the government has said that we are following due process of law. Whatever lawful provisions are there, as per those provisions, we are conducting justified, authorized and lawful surveillance. Meaning, if we have conducted surveillance using Pegasus, then it is not illegal, it's not unconstitutional. That's what the government is stating. It's saying that it is completely lawful interception, which is justified and authorized because it has been conducted as per due process of law. But as we understood, the legal safeguards that we have currently, they are not sufficient to protect your fundamental rights. The agencies are functioning in a very opaque manner. There isn't enough transparency in their functioning. There isn't enough accountability of our intelligence agencies. So that being the case, the government's argument may not stand in a court of law, right? But however, the government can always argue that it's well within its powers, within its rights to carry out such interception. So this is an ongoing debate. To what extent should we carry out state surveillance? Like I said, state surveillance is very much needed. It's needed to protect the country's national security, to deal with the security threats. But how do you check its misuse? How do you place a safeguard around it? This is the question that we have been dealing with since many decades. So what is the way forward? How can we deal with this in the future? This is where we make a case for intelligence reforms in the country. India is in desperate need of these reforms. Our intelligence agencies, especially the core intelligence agencies like IB, RAW and NTRO. Okay? IB is responsible for domestic intelligence, RAW is responsible for foreign intelligence, NTRO is responsible for all forms of technical and electronic intelligence. Such intelligence agencies, they should be brought under the law. Right now, they are not bound by any legal framework. We urgently have to create a legal framework which will regulate their functioning and their operations. So by doing that, you can make these agencies accountable to the parliament. Independent oversight can be established, just like it exists in the US, UK and the other countries. It could be one of the stronger checks and balances which will prevent the abuse of power by these intelligence agencies or by the government. So what we need is a legal framework to regulate the functioning and the operations of the intelligence agencies. Is that clear? Many attempts have been made in the past, but it has never moved forward. Just a few years back, a private member's bill was proposed in the parliament. A MP, Manish Tiwari, he brought out a private member's bill seeking to establish a legal framework for our intelligence agencies. But this proposal has never received enough support from the government. The government doesn't want to have parliamentary accountability for intelligence agencies on the grounds of security. On national security grounds, the government has derailed any such attempts to bring in a legal framework. But many experts have made this argument. Many former intelligence officers, former bureaucrats, then even several think tanks like IDSA, the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis. It's a government-funded think tank, funded by the Ministry of Defence. Even IDSA has brought out a research paper calling for intelligence reforms. The most important recommendation, the most widely accepted recommendation is that we have to create a legal framework for our intelligence agencies. This will bring independent oversight and make them accountable to the parliament. Then the powers of the government can be checked. The misuse of the powers by the government can be kept under check, at least to an extent. Maybe we could consider bringing all the organizations under a single framework. Maybe the current NSA, the National Security Advisor, his post could be reformed to make him the head of all the intelligence organizations. A single framework could be created so that the NSA could be held accountable by the parliament. Or maybe a Ministry of National Intelligence could be created, and that minister, the Minister for National Intelligence, could be held accountable by the parliament. These are various recommendations and proposals that exist. Okay? Then of course, we need more comprehensive legal safeguards. We need more transparent measures. The current safeguards under the IT Act and under the Telegraph Act, they are not sufficient. They are simply not sufficient. The process through which interception orders are given, the way in which it is reviewed, it is not sufficient. It's purely for internal accountability within the government. So we need to make these legal safeguards more comprehensive, ensure that there is external oversight through the parliament and through parliamentary committees. We have many parliamentary standing committees, but we don't have a standing committee for intelligence, right? Because right now, parliament cannot hold the intelligence agencies accountable. If such a legal framework is created, if the organization structure is streamlined, and if they are brought under the purview of the parliament, such standing committees can be formed. This will bring a system of checks and balances which will be more effective in checking the powers of the government. Okay? Then all the judicial guidelines in this regard, especially with regard to right to privacy and liberty, these guidelines of the court has to be followed. There has to be strict adherence. For example, the 4 test which was laid out under Puttaswamy case, it's not being followed in case of state surveillance, because agencies like IB and RAW are not lawful agencies. They have been set up through government orders. But the Supreme Court had clearly stated that any surveillance, any breach of privacy should be done as per law. There are laws that enable surveillance, but the agencies themselves are not lawful. These questions have been raised repeatedly by many legal experts. This is where the government needs to act upon. The government will have to ensure strict adherence to any judicial orders and guidelines. For example, the guidelines given in the PUCL case, right? The guidelines under KS Puttaswamy case. Such guidelines on right to privacy and liberty have to be strictly followed by the governments. Then finally, the last point, in the digital era, in the era of digital surveillance, what we need is a strong data protection law which will protect the privacy and the data security of the citizens. Unfortunately, even though India is one of the biggest internet markets, we still don't have a data protection law in place. A few years back, a committee was set up to recommend a data protection law known as the Justice Sri Krishna Committee. Based on the recommendations of this committee, a data protection bill has been drafted. This bill has been tabled in the parliament, but it has been pending in the parliament because it has raised a controversy in the parliament again, and currently it is going through a review by one of the parliamentary standing committees. The government has been unable to push through the data protection law. If there is a comprehensive data protection law which protects the rights, the data privacy and security rights of the users, of the citizens, it will go a long way in holding government agencies accountable. Because such a data protection law will not only hold the government agencies accountable, it will also hold any non-state actor accountable. Even private organizations, social media firms, internet service providers, right? Any entity which is collecting data, which is collecting user data, they will be held accountable through a data protection law. So India is in desperate need of these legislations. We need a data protection law and a legal framework for our intelligence agencies. These measures will go a long way in reforming the surveillance framework architecture, the surveillance architecture in India, and it will actually help in checking the unlimited powers that governments currently enjoy. It will act as a system of checks and balances and help hold the government accountable. These are the measures that are needed to ensure that state surveillance capabilities are not misused. We need to strike a balance. That is the need of the hour. State surveillance is required for protecting national security. At the same time, you have to protect constitutional rights and liberties. Okay? So with this, we come to the end of the session. Whatever we have discussed will be useful for both prelims and mains under polity and under internal security. So I hope this has been a useful session to break down this topic. I hope you have been able to understand some of the basic concepts which will help you in your mains answers. So with this, let's conclude the session. Thanks for watching. Good night.